At 5:30 on a Wednesday evening, I stood at the counter of a grocery store in Huntsville, Alabama, holding a container of soup that cost $6.11, and the card reader flashed red. I'm Malcolm Voss, 76 years old, and before I tell you what happened after that little red light, tell me where you're watching from tonight in the comments. Hit like, hit subscribe, and if anyone in your life has ever decided, quietly and without asking you, that you'd become someone who needed to be managed instead of respected, you already know exactly where this story is headed. The young man behind the register, a polite kid with a name tag that read Dominic, tried the card twice, then offered me the particular apologetic look reserved for elderly men holding up a line. "It's not going through, sir, sorry." "Try it once more," I said. He did. Red light again. Behind me, a man in scrubs sighed loudly enough that I felt it on the back of my neck. I told Dominic I'd come back, left the soup on the belt, and walked to my car in the parking lot with my hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from something colder. I had a very specific feeling, the kind you get in a lab when a number that should never be wrong suddenly is. And you know before you even check the equipment that somebody has changed something without telling you. I called my daughter Kelly from the driver's seat. "Hi, Dad?" Her voice had that rehearsed brightness people use when they've been expecting a call and dreading it. "My card was declined at the store, Kelly. $6. A pause. Then carefully. "Yeah, so Dave and I talked about it, and we set up a monthly budget on the account. Just to help things stay a little more predictable." I sat very still in the driver's seat. A budget. On my account. We didn't want to make a big deal out of it. We've just noticed things have been a little harder for you lately, and Dave thought it made sense to simplify things before. In the background, I heard my son-in-law's voice, not lowered at all. "Just tell him it's for his own safety." Kelly didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. I'd heard it clearly enough through the phone. "I understand," I said. "Thank you." And I hung up because I have spent an entire career learning that the moment you want to raise your voice in a room full of people who've already decided you're wrong is exactly the moment. You should lower it instead. I didn't drive home. I drove to my bank. Let me tell you who I actually am because it matters for everything that follows. For the past 11 years, since my wife Diane died of a heart attack in our garden, most people in my life have known me as a quiet widower who lives alone in a modest brick ranch house on Whitworth Drive, drives a 12-year-old Buick, keeps a small herb garden, and volunteers Tuesday mornings at the public library. What almost nobody in my current life knows, because I stopped mentioning it decades ago when it stopped seeming relevant to anyone around me, is that from 1974 until my retirement in 2005, I worked as a propulsion systems engineer at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, right there in Huntsville. 31 years. I hold 12 patents, several related to solid rocket motor design that are still licensed commercially today, generating quarterly royalty payments that, combined with my pension and careful investments Diane and I made together, mean I have never once in my adult life needed anyone's permission to buy a $6 container of soup. I never talked about the work. Diane used to say I left my slide rule at the office and came home just her husband, and I liked that division. My daughter Kelly grew up believing her father did math for the government, which was technically not a lie and mostly what a busy teenager wanted to believe anyway. Kelly married Dave Renwick 14 years ago. Dave manages a regional chain of auto parts stores, a decent, hard-working, occasionally overconfident man who has called me Malcolm for 14 years. Never Dad, which I never bothered correcting, the same way I never correct people who assume a widower driving an old Buick must be counting pennies. About 8 months ago, Dave started helping with my finances. It began small. He noticed I still balanced my checkbook by hand and offered to set up online banking. I let him, mostly to please Kelly, and because computers have never much interested me. Strange, I know, for a man who spent 3 decades doing propulsion calculations. But rockets and smartphones are very different kinds of machines. He installed the apps, reset the passwords for security, linked accounts. I trusted him. He was my daughter's husband and the father of my 2 grandchildren. I want to tell you about the moment I should have paid closer attention to, because I've replayed it since. About 5 months ago at a family dinner, I misplaced my car keys for the 2nd time in a week. I'd left them in the refrigerator door, of all places, thinking about a recipe. My grandson Tyler, 14, said to his mother, not unkindly, just thoughtlessly the way teenagers say things, "Grandpa's getting kind of scattered lately, isn't he?" Kelly laughed it off. I laughed it off too. Everyone misplaces keys. I didn't think about that sentence again until 3 weeks ago, when I arrived at Kelly and Dave's house for what I believed was an ordinary Sunday dinner, and found something waiting on their kitchen table that would occupy the next several months of my life. Dave was seated at the head of the table with a manila folder squared perfectly in front of him, the posture of a man who had rehearsed a speech and wanted the folder noticed before he was. Kelly stood at the stove, back half-turned. My granddaughter Emma, 11, was doing homework at the island. Tyler leaned against the doorway. "Malcolm," Dave said, "sit down. There's something we need to talk through." I sat. He slid the folder across the table. Inside was a petition for guardianship, my name printed at the top, and beneath it a durable power of attorney form, partially filled in, naming Dave Renwick as agent. I read every line twice before I said a word. Because in 31 years of engineering review boards, I learned that the person who speaks first in a room like that is almost always the one who loses control of the conversation. "What exactly has prompted this?" I said finally. "Medically speaking." Dave shifted. "We've talked to Dr. Okafor. He agreed it made sense to have protective structures ready given some of what we've noticed." "What has Dr. Okafor actually documented?" "He hasn't done a full evaluation yet. We wanted the framework in place first, so there's no diagnosis, not yet. But Malcolm, you left the stove burner on last month." Kelly told me. I looked at my daughter. She kept her eyes on the pan. "I left a burner on low for perhaps 8 minutes, Dave, and I noticed it and turned it off myself, the same way any person occasionally does." I turned back to him. "What else? You've been forgetting things, the keys, missing your dermatology appointment in March." "That appointment was rescheduled by the office without anyone informing me. I confirmed that myself with the receptionist the same week." Dave's jaw tightened. Tyler from the doorway said quietly, "Dad, maybe—" "Tyler," Dave said, and Tyler stopped. I closed the folder and set my hands flat on the table. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a truthful answer. Has an attorney reviewed this petition, or is this something you drafted yourselves from a form online?" The silence answered more clearly than any words could have. "I appreciate that you believe you're acting out of concern," I said, standing, gathering my coat. "I need time to think about this." I looked at Kelly. "Thank you for dinner. I think I'll head home now." "Dad, please don't be like this," Kelly said, finally turning from the stove, her eyes bright and unhappy. "Like what?" I said. "Composed?" I drove home through the dark Huntsville streets with the radio off, and for the first time in a long while I felt the old, familiar cold clarity that used to settle over me the night before a critical design review. Not anger, which I had watched ruin more than one promising engineer's career in front of me over the decades, but something quieter and more dangerous to whoever was on the other side of it. The precise stillness of a man who has just realized he is being profoundly underestimated by people who have no real idea what he is actually capable of. The next morning, I called my old NASA colleague and dear friend, Patricia Alonso, who had left engineering in her 50s to become an elder law attorney after watching her own father go through something disturbingly similar. She had built a respected practice specializing in exactly this kind of case. "Malcolm," she said when she picked up, "it's been months. Tell me you're calling with good news." I told her everything. The frozen card, the guardianship petition sitting half-drafted on my daughter's kitchen table, the absence of any real diagnosis. She was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "An undiagnosed elderly parent, restricted account access, a family-drafted guardianship petition with no medical basis behind it. This is one of the most common early patterns in cases that eventually become full financial exploitation. I'm not saying that's what this definitely is, but treat it as seriously as if it were until we know otherwise. That's exactly why I called. First, I want a full independent cognitive evaluation, not through Dr. Okafor, since your family already has a relationship with him, and there may be pressure there, intentional or not. Someone with zero connection to your family. Second, do not sign anything at all, even something that looks harmless. Agreed on both. Over the following 3 weeks, I did precisely what Patricia advised. And I did something else besides, something that came naturally after decades in aerospace engineering. I documented everything. I opened a spiral notebook, the kind I used to fill with calculations, and I began recording dates, exact wording, timestamps, the same discipline I'd once applied to test data, March 3rd. Dave mentioned, unprompted, that the assisted living place out on Bailey Cove has a very nice memory wing. Just so you're aware it exists, March 9th. Kelly called to check in, asked twice in one conversation whether I remembered taking my blood pressure medication, which I have taken at the identical time daily for 9 years, March 16th. Tyler, at a family gathering, told a neighbor's teenage son that Grandpa's not really all there anymore, while I stood close enough to hear every word over a plate of potato salad. Alone, each entry sounded like nothing. A concerned family checking on an aging father. Together in that notebook, they formed something else entirely, a quiet, incremental construction of a narrative of my incompetence, built without a shred of medical evidence. In order to justify controlling my finances, I saw the neuropsychologist Patricia recommended, Dr. Elena Marsh, on a Thursday. 4 hours of cognitive testing. She called with results 2 weeks later. Mr. Voss, she said, I had deliberately not mentioned my career, wanting unbiased results. Your cognitive function is entirely within normal range for your age, and honestly above normal range on several measures, particularly spatial reasoning and processing speed. There is no evidence whatsoever of dementia or mild cognitive impairment. I sat with that in my kitchen at the same table where years ago I used to grade Kelly's math homework. I need that documented, notarized, dated 2 copies. Of course. May I ask what prompted this? My family, I said, has decided I might need protecting from myself. I'd like to know on paper whether they're right. Patricia called the moment Dr. Marsh's report arrived. This is exactly what we needed. A clean, independent, notarized evaluation showing full capacity, obtained before any petition was actually filed. If Dave moves forward now, he's not simply going to lose. He's going to have pursued legal action against a fully competent adult, based purely on assumption. There was one more piece, and it came from an unexpected place. My old friend and neighbor Harold Kessler, a retired bank compliance officer, stopped by to return a ladder. Over coffee, I mentioned the frozen card almost as an aside. Harold set his cup down slowly. Malcolm, did you personally authorize that hold in writing? No. Did the bank contact you directly to confirm you wanted it? No one from the bank spoke to me at all. The following Monday, I walked into my branch and sat down with the manager, a woman named Denise Palmer, who pulled up my account, and her expression changed almost immediately. Mr. Voss, I'm seeing a joint access request submitted about 7 weeks ago granting secondary access to David Renwick and a spending limit placed shortly after. I never authorized that. She turned the screen toward me. There, digitally signed, was my name. On a document I had never seen in my life. Can that be verified? I asked, though I already knew. We can have our fraud department review it immediately, if you believe it wasn't authorized by you. I believe exactly that. I want to tell you what I felt walking out of that bank, because it would have been easy to feel simple anger toward my son-in-law. What I actually felt standing in that parking lot was closer to grief. Somewhere in the last year, a man I had welcomed into my family had decided the easiest way to manage an inconvenient older man was not to speak with him honestly, but to quietly maneuver around him. I called Patricia that evening and told her about the signature. She was quiet for a moment. Malcolm, I need to ask you something important. What outcome do you actually want here? We now have enough. The capacity evaluation, the documented pattern, potentially a forged signature, to pursue this aggressively if you choose. Formal complaint, cease and desist, potentially a referral for investigation. I thought about Kelly standing at that stove, unable to look at me. I thought about Tyler and Emma. I don't want to destroy my daughter's marriage, I said finally, but I'm not going to sit quietly while a man decides, without one shred of medical evidence, that I've become someone who needs managing instead of asking. I want the truth on the table, all of it, and then I want to see what they do with it. That, Patricia said, I can help you build. We spent 2 weeks preparing. Patricia drafted a formal letter, revoking any account access Dave had been granted, supported by the bank's own findings, which confirmed within 10 days that the signature authorizing his access did not match any verified signature on file for me, and had been submitted using login credentials Dave himself had set up on my behalf under the guise of helping with online banking. I invited Kelly and Dave to my house myself, a simple phone call. I'd like you both to come Sunday evening. There are things I need to go over. Dad, is everything okay? Everything is about to be very clear, I said. They arrived at 6. Patricia sat quietly at the end of my dining table, introduced simply as my attorney, a phrase that visibly unsettled both of them the instant I said it. Your attorney? Dave repeated. Patricia and I worked together for many years, I said, which was true enough, if not the full picture yet. Please sit. I opened my own folder, placing it in the center of the table where Dave's had sat weeks earlier. First, I want you both to see this. I slid Dr. Marsh's evaluation across. Kelly picked it up, read the summary, and went pale. Full capacity. No evidence of cognitive impairment. I had this done 3 weeks ago, I said, by a specialist with no connection whatsoever to our family. Precisely because I wanted an honest answer to a question you two had already decided you knew. Dad, we never said you had dementia, Dave said. We were being cautious. You drafted a guardianship petition, I said calmly, based on misplaced keys, one unattended burner for 8 minutes, and a rescheduled appointment that wasn't even my error. That isn't caution, Dave. That's a conclusion you'd already reached, looking for evidence to support it. I slid the second document across, the bank's findings. Dave's face lost the last of its color. I never forged anything deliberately, he said quickly. I had access already from the online banking setup. I used the same login. You didn't think you needed to ask, I said, finishing his sentence. That's the entire problem. Not that you didn't care. I believe you cared. The problem is that somewhere along the way, you stopped believing you needed my permission to make decisions about my own life. The room went silent. Finally, I told them who I actually was. For 31 years, I said quietly, before I retired, I worked as a propulsion engineer at NASA Marshall. I hold 12 patents. Several are still licensed commercially and generate royalty income every quarter. I have never once in my entire adult life needed to worry about affording a $6 container of soup. I looked at Kelly. I never made a point of telling you, because I never wanted the work to define how you saw your father. I wanted you to know me as your dad, not a resume. Kelly stared at me. NASA, this whole time? This whole time. Dave put both hands over his face for a long moment. When he lowered them, his eyes were wet, and I want to be fair here because what came next was not performance. I convinced myself I was protecting you, he said. I kept telling myself, if something happens later and we haven't set anything up, it'll be so much harder. I never once sat down and actually asked you what you wanted. He looked at Kelly. I told you I'd talked it through with him. You told me he agreed it made sense, Kelly said slowly. You never said you'd actually asked him directly. I never asked him, Dave admitted. Not really. I let that settle in the room, because there is nothing more useful than allowing people to hear their own admissions spoken aloud without anyone rushing to soften them. I'm not here tonight to file anything against either of you, I said. Patricia can tell you we could, but that isn't what I want. I closed the folder. What I want is for this family to understand that concern is not the same thing as control, and love does not give anyone the right to quietly manage another adult's life without asking first. Kelly was crying quietly now. I let it happen, she said. I saw the little comments Tyler made. I saw Dave filling out those forms, and I told myself it was easier to go along with it than make waves. I know, I said gently. That's often exactly how it happens. Not one great betrayal, a dozen small agreements to stay quiet. We talked for nearly 2 more hours. I told them honestly that I had revoked Dave's account access, that the bank's restrictions had been lifted, and that I would not pursue any formal complaint as long as nothing like this happened again, without an honest conversation first. Before they left, Tyler, who had been sitting quietly on the stairs the whole evening, came into the kitchen. Grandpa, he said, I didn't know any of that. About NASA, or the bank thing. I know you didn't. I said that stuff about you not being all there, in front of people. I'm really sorry. I repeated what the adults around you were saying, I said. That's not entirely on you. But I hope you remember, next time you hear someone talk about an older person that way, that there's usually a lot more to the story than a misplaced set of keys. The months that followed weren't dramatic. There was no single grand reconciliation scene. Dave called himself without Kelly prompting him about 2 weeks later and asked if he could take me to lunch, just the two of us. We sat in a diner booth for nearly 2 hours. He asked me for the first time in 14 years of marriage to my daughter, real questions about my career, about the projects I'd worked on, about what it had actually meant to design something that helped carry human beings safely off the surface of the earth. Not performed curiosity, real questions. I think, he said toward the end, turning his coffee cup slowly, I got so focused on being the responsible one, on having everything handled, that I stopped seeing you as a person with opinions about your own life. I just saw a problem to manage before it got bigger. That's the danger of good intentions, I told him. They rarely feel like arrogance from the inside. Kelly started calling more often, not to check on my medication, but simply to talk, the way we used to before all this began. Tyler started coming by on Saturday mornings, ostensibly to help in my garden, though I suspect it was mostly an excuse to sit and ask questions about rockets and patents and what it had actually been like working in that engineering building in 1974. I found I didn't mind the questions at all. I found, honestly, that I had missed being asked things by my family instead of being quietly managed by them. About a year after that Wednesday evening at the grocery store, I walked back into the same store, picked up the same brand of soup, and handed my card to the same young cashier, Dominic. 611, he said. The card went through without a sound, no hesitation, no red light, no line of strangers wondering quietly whether the elderly man in front of them had started to slip. Just an ordinary transaction on an ordinary evening. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Tyler, coming by Saturday to help with the tomatoes, if that's still good. Also wanted to ask you about the shuttle program stuff you mentioned. I smiled, got into my old Buick, and drove home through the quiet Huntsville evening. The lesson I carry out of all this is not complicated, though it took me 3 decades of engineering discipline and 1 very difficult year to fully understand it inside my own family, and not just inside a research lab full of colleagues. Loving someone does not give you the authority to decide, quietly and without asking, that they've become incapable. Real respect means asking the harder question directly, even when assuming feels faster and kinder in the moment. And sometimes the people who most need reminding of a person's full worth are the ones who love them the most, and simply forgot to ask before they started managing. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, a parent, a grandparent, or perhaps even yourself, I hope you'll remember to ask before you assume. And if it moved you, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribed for more stories about family, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to demand to be asked instead of managed.